The K-shaped recovery, the impact of COVID-19 on emergency housing in New Zealand. Hello, my name is Lynn Murphy. I'm from AUT University, Auckland, New Zealand. My co-author is Terry Quilty from Manukau Institute of Technology, Auckland, New Zealand. In March 2020, New Zealand pursued a COVID-19 elimination strategy including stringent public health measures, strict lockdowns, managed quarantine requirements, testing, contact tracing, social distancing, vaccination, and travel restrictions. In March 2020, New Zealand had just over 100 COVID-19 cases and no deaths. The New Zealand strategy was to go early and go hard, to keep it out, find it and stamp it out. This can be contrasted with the mitigation and suppression approaches of most Western countries and the alternative herd immunity strategy. New Zealand's strategy enabled it to be effectively manage community transmission of COVID-19 while the country improved contact tracing and large-scale testing and the world develop and test new vaccines. This results in New Zealand suffering fewer infections and deaths compared to the rest of the world. New Zealand moved to a COVID minimisation and protection strategy in early 2022. This change was due to inability to eliminate COVID, the lower severity of Omicron, the relatively high vaccination coverage of the population, and the economic costs of elimination. The minimisation and protection strategy aimed to flatten the curve and minimise the risk of health service overload and social and economic disruptions. Currently, New Zealand has a total population of 5 million. The high infection rate of Omicron has pushed cumulative numbers of COVID cases to over 1.28 million and deaths to 1,350. New Zealand's death rate is at a comparable level to other countries during an Omicron wave. The economic strategy. The New Zealand government adopted measures to facilitate a quick post-COVID recovery, including a New Zealand $50 billion pandemic response package, a record low borrowing rates, mortgage payment holidays for homeowners, and a New Zealand $100 billion quantitative easing program, printing money to buy back government bonds. The economic strategy saved jobs but significantly increased housing affordability. Cheaper mortgages allowed the wealthier population to build up portfolios of rental investment properties. In contrast, rapidly rising house prices locked out first-home buyers and low-income earners. Statistics New Zealand reports significant building issues fueled by COVID-19 related shortages of labour and building supplies and decreased productivity due to lockdowns. Rents increased, spurred by the housing shortage and growing population. New Zealand topped the list for the most unaffordable housing amongst OECD nations. While the government spent substantial amounts on short-term emergency accommodation for the poor, it directed very little into building permanent new homes. Because the border had closed to visitors, motels and hotels had spare capacity. The New Zealand government stopped funding private rentals as emergency housing and instead commissioned motels and hotels. There were, however, issues with emergency housing. The New Zealand government paid private landlords above market rates for emergency housing and failed to monitor the quality of the properties. Private rentals, which were getting $1,400 a week in income, were rented to the government for $3,900 a week. The government also funded motels, which were unsuitable for long-term tenancies, especially families, and needed to be more sensitive to the needs of tenants. Motels can be unsafe and unsanitary. Patterson reports the experiences of those in emergency accommodation as intimidating and terrifying, with young families living next to gang members. Due to limited resources, support services, though needed, are seldom provided. Violence and crime are common. Emergency housing is usually for larger families and had higher needs, including space for their belongings. A one-room motel cannot provide this. The long-term physical and psychological toll of living in this environment is yet to be fully quantified. New Zealand has always had a high dependence on immigrant workers. The closing of the borders has resulted in severe labour shortages within New Zealand. Health workers, in particular mental health and support workers, are in short supply. The building and construction industry is desperate for staff. The cost of labour has increased dramatically, which has resulted in increased inflation and increased numbers of people requiring housing assistance. Home ownership has traditionally been an important milestone in the lives of New Zealanders. Housing has become increasingly unaffordable for many New Zealanders. Home ownership peaked in the 1990s at 74%, but by 2018 this had reduced to 64.6%. It is estimated that this percentage has fallen further since the last census. Rising interest rates, availability of credit, and a post-COVID property boom that added another 40% to the price of real estate in New Zealand. The government needs to plan for when the borders open, tourists return, and motels revert back to normal business. The homeless risk being displaced from motels by returning tourists. Motels are better than families living in parked cars. There are also opportunities to assist New Zealanders in the purchase of their first home. A long-term solution to New Zealand's housing problem has yet to be reached. Thank you for your time.